Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to give you a very brief introduction now in Portuguese before the lecture begins. So, boa tarde a todos e bem-vindos a mais uma sessão especial do evento Abralim ao Vivo, Linguistas Online. Este evento é uma iniciativa da Abralim, Associação Brasileira de Linguística, em cooperação com o Comitê Internacional Permanente des Linguistes, a Associação de Linguística e Filologia de América Latina, a Sociedade Argentina de Estudos Linguísticos, a Associação de Linguística Aplicada do Brasil, a Linguistics Association of Great Britain and Linguistic Society of America. Eu sou Cristina Stenzel, da UFRJ, e o nosso convidado hoje é Dr. David Harrison, especialista no estudo de línguas ameaçadas e professor de linguística do Swarthmore College, dos Estados Unidos. Dr. Harrison já desenvolveu pesquisa em vários locais, inicialmente na Sibéria, onde trabalhou com os nômades Tuvan, e mais tarde entre povos da Mongólia, Bolívia, Índia, Micronésia e na ilha de Vanuatu. Em 2004, Dr. Harrison foi um dos fundadores do Living Tongues Institute for Endangered Languages, uma organização sem fins lucrativos dedicada à documentação e revitalização de línguas minoritárias. Em 2007, ele publicou o livro When Languages Die, The Extinction of Human Languages and the Erosion of Human Knowledge, que investiga as consequências científicas da perda linguística e traz encontros com os últimos falantes de línguas em diversos lugares do planeta. Dr. Harrison também é produtor de filmes documentários, é um National Geographic Explorer e Fellow do Explorers Club. Dr. Harris vai falar conosco hoje sobre linguística e meio ambiente. E gostaria de dizer que no final da apresentação haverá um tempo para perguntas que devem ser enviados pelo chat. Agradecemos muito a presença do Dr. Harrison neste evento e agora passo a palavra para ele. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Harrison.
Thank you, Professor Stenzel and Professor Oliveira. I very much appreciate this opportunity. Bom dia to everyone, and thank you. Environmental linguistics uses the tools of linguistics, both theoretical and applied, to explore environmental knowledge. This knowledge is uniquely encoded in the world's languages, with special emphasis on indigenous and endangered languages. Now, this area of intellectual inquiry is not new. Indigenous communities have always linked language with environment. I'll demonstrate this with case studies from Vanuatu, Russia, and Mexico. Environmental linguistics relies on collaborative work between indigenous experts and linguists. It can serve language revitalization while also advancing science and conservation. I'm going to share my screen now. My talk today on environmental linguistics is dedicated to the memory of a colleague of mine, Mr. Philemon Allah, a colleague from Vanuatu who passed away recently. Vanuatu is located in the South Pacific, northeast of Australia. It is a biodiversity hotspot with many endemic plant and animal species. It is also the #1 language hotspot with the highest density of languages per capita. Philemon's scientific background was in forestry and conservation, but he also loved his native language called Raga. Raga is one of the 113 languages spoken in Vanuatu in a population of just 275,000 people. Now, because Philemon loved both plants and his native language, he collected a comprehensive list of Raga names for local plants on Pentecost Island, which is where he was born. At the time he passed away in late 2019, his list had over 500 entries. Now, besides knowing the plant names, Philemon also had a lifetime of experience in using these plants. For example, A traditional Vanuatu house is made of at least 15 different plants, each gathered in different locations and processed in different ways. The go-to-em is the vine that is heated over the fire and used to tie together the posts of the cyclone house. Miscanthus, a wild cane, is used to weave the wall lattice. Bamboo is used for the walls, and coconut leaf is used for the roof thatching. Without precise knowledge of these plants, you cannot build a house like this, which provides the only safe shelter from cyclones. So my colleague Philemon Allah had collected over 500 names for plants in the Raga language. Most of these names did not have a direct one-to-one translation in Bislama, which is the national language of Vanuatu. For example, here are two ferns that have two different scientific names. They also happen to have two different names in the Raga language, shown in red. One is called Buhi Buhi, the other is called Sinvataha. But in Bislama, the national language that many young Raga people are now speaking exclusively, these two ferns are both called bush cabbage, a broad category that includes many other plants. So there will be a loss of knowledge as people switch from minority languages like Raga to majority languages like Bislama. I've been working in Vanuatu for the past 5 years with botanists from the New York Botanical Garden and with local experts on a project called Plants Mo People Belong Vanuatu, funded by the US National Science Foundation. We've been collecting hundreds of plant specimens, and my role as the linguist on the project is to record the names of plants in 6 local languages, including Raga, and knowledge about how to use these plants. Many of these plants are entirely new to science because a floristic survey of the islands has not yet been completed, and so they don't yet have scientific names. Here's a photo of our team working on Futuna Island, where the botanists had just returned from a full day in the forest collecting plants. And they laid all the plants out in the village and began to photograph them. Our local consultant, Takaronga Kautonga, looked at the collected plants and said, quote, "We have names for all these plants in our language," end quote. And then he began to recite the names and I began to write them down. When he said our language, he was not referring to English, French, or Bislama, all of which he speaks fluently, but to Futuna, a small Polynesian language which has perhaps 500 speakers. It was important for him to say this and for us scientists to pay attention. In fact, if scientists on any expedition like this speak to a local expert, they will most likely be told that the local names for plants, birds, and animals do exist. Not only names, but taxonomies and technologies for using the plants and animals. So the only real discovery to be made here is, what do the locals know about it? Now, since there are more than 10,000 species of ferns worldwide, maybe it's not so important to have vernacular names that distinguish them. But when you look at the medicinal properties of ferns, you see that they have many benefits. Ferns also grow in the Himalayas in India, and this is a photograph of my friend Anthony Degio, a speaker of the highly endangered Koro-Aka language, talking about ferns and their medicinal uses. It's crucial to distinguish among the different types, and that is a skill that Anthony, like Philemon, can do through his language. No matter what island or mountain community we may visit, we find a deep knowledge of the natural land and sea environment and sophisticated linguistic nomenclatures and taxonomies for describing them. It is both exciting and humbling to see what people know about the environment. The intersect between language and environment is an inspiring place to do environmental linguistics, the topic of today's talk. There is also a sense of urgency because many species are threatened and much of the biosphere is not yet documented. If you ask a biologist, they will tell you that perhaps 80% of the plant and animal species on Earth are not yet known to science, and many of them are endangered. But when I say not known to science, this does not mean that they are unknown to local people. So if you talk with local experts like Anselon Saru on the island of Futuna, he can name 250 species of fish found in the waters around his island. If you meet Ilarion Zamos Condori, a speaker and a healer of the Kallawaya language of Bolivia, his people know and use more than 1,200 medicinal plants. And so you begin to see the vast knowledge base that humans possess about the natural world. Both Anselon and Ilarion also live in places that are disproportionately experiencing climate change, low-lying Pacific islands and high Andes, and so they are also witnessing those effects. Now, the world's languages are also endangered, and so it turns out that much, if not most, of what people know about plants and animals, much of what humans know about the planet, species, and ecosystems is knowledge that is only orally transmitted and found in small languages which are themselves endangered. So there is a deep connection between biodiversity, language diversity, and our ability to sustain both. The world's languages are very unevenly distributed across population. You can see that the 85 biggest languages account for almost 79% of the world's population. Then we have a medium-sized group of languages, about 3,000, that account for 21% of the world's population. And then we have the majority of the world's languages, more than 3,500, which are spoken by just 0.1% of the world's population. So this explains a sense of urgency as we look at these endangered languages. In 2010, I launched the concept of language hotspots, and this map was published in National Geographic magazine, including in the Brazilian edition of National Geographic magazine. This map shows 13 of the areas in the world that have the highest diversity of languages, the highest levels of endangerment, and the lowest levels of scientific documentation. Those are language hotspots. And today I'll be giving examples from around the world, but I'd like to focus on 3 places that are language hotspots. The first, which I already mentioned, is Vanuatu in Eastern Melanesia. Then we will take a look at Siberia in North Asia and Mexico in North America. In each location, we'll see cultures with rich environmental knowledge that is uniquely encoded in their languages and also threatened. First, we'll take a look at Tuva and Siberia more broadly, which is a language hotspot. I started my research career as a linguist in Tuva when I was in graduate school by spending a year living with nomads and learning their language. Tuvans perceive the world through the lens of their language. I learned, for example, never to ask how far a destination is, but how many nights it would take to arrive. I learned not to ask how old a person was, but how many snows had they seen. And I learned not to ask if a person was well, but rather to ask if their sheep were fat. When talking with Tuvan nomads, I noticed that although they could talk about many different topics, the conversation almost always turned to nature. And so it was my conversation with Tuvans that first directed my attention to the ways in which languages encode nature. Environmental linguistics explores this knowledge and the connections between language diversity and biodiversity. It recognizes that most human knowledge about the natural environment is uniquely encoded in smaller, often endangered languages. Environmental knowledge is primarily found in the lexicon, but it may also be encoded in phonemes, morphemes, phrases, in metaphors and taxonomies, in spatial orientation systems, deixis, in sound mimesis, counting, wayfinding and navigation, time reckoning, calendrics, oral narratives, and the verbal arts. So we do find environmental knowledge at every structural level of language. In my book, When Languages Die, which has been also translated into Spanish and Arabic, but not yet into Portuguese, each chapter is devoted to a different domain of knowledge that is uniquely encoded in language. Today, I will be talking about 5 domains of knowledge that connect us to the natural world using examples from the 3 locations, Vanuatu, Siberia, and Mexico. Well, animals are always a good place to start if you're talking about the natural world. And in living and migrating with Tuvan nomads, I learned about their deep knowledge and expertise for domesticated animals, including yaks, camels, horses, goats, and sheep. They have a very complex vocabulary for naming at least 24 different colors and patterns of goats and other animals. Some Tuvans also herd reindeer, and they have a very complex naming system that classifies reindeer according to 4 parameters. The first parameter is the age of the reindeer. Secondly, the sex of the reindeer. Thirdly, the fertility of the reindeer. And fourthly, the rideability of the reindeer. This is not only a taxonomy, a hierarchically organized set of names, but it is also a technology. It allows a reindeer herder to efficiently describe a reindeer with very few words. For example, the Tuvan word charim expresses in a single word what we would need many words to express in English. It means my 3-year-old male uncastrated rideable reindeer. Another area of environmental knowledge that I noticed and came to appreciate among Tuvans is their ability to encode mental maps of landscapes and to apply these when wayfinding. Tuvans migrate and they can find their way across vast landscapes. They are never lost despite a complete lack of roads, signs, GPS, or maps. They have names for very subtle features of the landscape, ones that I had personally never noticed. For example, the word E in Tuvan refers to the short side of a hill. Once you know this word, you begin to look at hills differently. Tuvans have 5 different words for go, and in order to select the correct one, you must always maintain an awareness of where the nearest river is and what direction the current is flowing in the river, and your trajectory relative to the current. In talking with shamans and storytellers, I also learned that Tuvans view the past as located in front of them, where it is visible, and the future they view as being located behind them, where you cannot see it. So environmental linguistics includes what some people have called landscape linguistics, the study of how people perceive and interact with landscapes through their language. Among the Tuvans and related people who live just north of them in Siberia, there are also ancient systems of timekeeping that link the moon phases to natural events. These are environmental calendars. These calendars are mostly forgotten now, but I was able to reconstruct some of them based on conversations and fragmentary memories of the elders. And I would like to play for you a very brief video in which 3 of the last speakers of the Us language, Vasya Gabov, Ivan Skoblin, and Anna Badeyeva, are talking about and trying to recall the environmental calendar that they once knew.
Пристигає кайте воду. Тут не булган кайте. Пристигає. Ай.
Кайте ката кункая, кузуканая. Каркая. Кокая это майя. Манана кокая майя.
Кокая.
Амта кайнар. Парчаин пилкем дядам за пескилка.
So in this video, you can see the erosion of knowledge as they are struggling to recall the names of the environmental calendar that they once used. Environmental calendars are highly local and adaptive. For example, 2 Siberian villages that I visited that are just a couple days hike apart from each other and speak the same language use different calendars. One is more focused on gathering activities, the other on hunting, and both of them include reindeer. In talking with hunters like Artyom Kishtayev, shown here, I learned that they are always very aware of where they are in the annual cycle and what work needs to be done, all without clocks or calendars. Another area where environmental is encoded for Tuvans, and I believe all other people, is in their verbal arts. Legends, myths, stories, and songs. Most of the world's languages do not use writing, and so all the information is stored in memory and transmitted only orally. Many stories give specific instructions on the proper relations between humans and nature, and therefore represent a philosophy or strategy for conservation. The Tuvan nomads that I lived amongst place great value on storytelling. Their epic stories and other verbal art genres are rich sources of environmental knowledge. Tuvan storyteller Shoydak-ool Khovalyg, shown here, could recite up to 10,000 lines of an epic tale from memory. It was a heroic tale about a girl who sets off on a quest to save her family, but it was also dense with references to the natural world, animals, plants, and also the spiritual world, magic and mythical beings. Siberian hunter-gatherers and reindeer herders have a deep spiritual and intellectual attachment to the land, and this is reflected in their grammar and their vocabulary. For my consultant, Marta Kongarayeva, who had spent her entire life hunting, much of her expertise was expressed in songs that she used to sing as she walked through the forest. Her language, called Tofa, was uniquely adapted to forest life, and she could tell many tales that expressed the proper relation of humans to the environment. Unfortunately, her Tofa language is now nearly extinct, with only a few elderly speakers remaining, and so the knowledge is being lost. Moving on from Siberia, the language hotspot we've just visited, where we saw several different manifestations of environmental knowledge, I'd like to come back now to Vanuatu in the South Pacific, where I began my talk. I mentioned earlier that botanists were collecting plants on Futuna Island, where the local people already have names for those plants. But accessing those names requires the tools of linguistics. Botanists are not trained in phonetic transcription, recording, or elicitation, just as I, a linguist, am not trained in identifying plants. And so I work with speakers to record the names and their knowledge and to build a talking dictionary. I recruit experts who are willing to share and record their voices, put these recordings into a talking dictionary with photos and definitions and examples of usage. And at every stage, I share and show the results to the community so they can see, hear, and approve of the content. Every single entry in the dictionary is credited to the person who contributed it, so it is truly a community-authored work. Another area of environmental knowledge that I noticed on Futuna Island, but that comes up over and over again, is how people use numbers and counting to make sense of the world, and Futuna is no exception. The world's languages have many ways of counting and doing mathematics. We are most familiar with a base 10 number system, although for counting time, we use a base 12 system. But many languages use 2, 4, 6, 12, or 20 as bases to build larger numbers. There are also body counting systems that do not use number words at all, but rather use the names of body parts or locations on the body to count. And they can count very high, including, it has been claimed, perhaps as high to infinity for some of these systems. These different ways of doing mathematics are also different ways of understanding the natural world, and they are highly endangered and disappearing. Now, in cultures that do have numbers in mathematics, it is not just for utilitarian purposes. Mathematics can be performed as a recreation, a game, as shown here with two young men in Vanuatu who are exercising their memories and mathematical skills in a competitive game called Amkeatasi. Now, because Futuna is a small island with just 500 people, there is a strong dependency on the ocean and thus a deep knowledge about everything in it. Fishermen like Anselon Seru are some of the key bearers of culture despite their relatively young ages. As I mentioned earlier, Ansalon is able to name 250 species of fish, some of which are new to science. If you look in published guidebooks of Pacific fishes, you will find some fish that are lumped together under a single species, but that Ansalon distinguishes as different fish based on their diet or behavior. In other words, there are more folk species in the Futuna language than there are scientific taxonomic species. It is a many-to-one mapping. I'd like to play now a short video for you in which Ansalon, the expert fisherman of Futuna Island, demonstrates a song and dance ritual performance by fishermen when they return with their catch. Now, tuna fish are a prize catch because the whole village will eat. To celebrate the occasion, Futunese fishermen perform a ritual song and dance known as popokina. The song is begun as soon as the tuna is caught while they are still sitting in their canoes offshore, and it continues in stages until the tuna is brought to the village for consumption. The song has 4 stanzas, and each stanza refers to a plant which identifies a location. The first location is in the waters offshore, secondly, the beach, thirdly, the path going up to the village, and fourthly, the village, which is in the interior of the island. The first stanza mentions a coastal tree species with large pyramidal-shaped fruits which break off and float out to sea, near where the tuna is caught. Once ashore, they dance on the beach and they sing the second stanza, which features and mentions a vine with purple flowers that grows on the beach, known as fuya. Up in the village, people hear the song and they prepare to cook the fish. The third stanza is sung on the pathway leading to the village, and it refers to a hibiscus plant found along the way. And the last stanza, representing the island's interior and the village, is located by sinu, a large tree bearing yellow flowers that grows in the village, where the fish will be cooked and eaten by all, except for the fishermen themselves, for whom eating tuna is a taboo. So now I'll play one small part of this celebratory ritual song and dance for catching a fish on Futuna Island. So that is the joy and the excitement that is experienced on Futuna Island when they catch a tuna fish. But as a fisherman, Ansalon is not allowed to eat that tuna fish. So what do you do if you've caught a fish but you're not allowed to eat it? Well, he likes to photograph his fish and upload them to his social media. And so this is an example of how people are technologizing indigenous knowledge and languages. Now, if you are out fishing, another key domain of knowledge, which Ansalon has, besides fish names, is how to navigate and get back to the home island after sailing fairly long distances. Fishermen like Ansalon are agents of ecological balance and change. They're not merely skilled technicians, but they operate within a complex web of environmental knowledge, beliefs, rituals, taboos. They understand fish behavior, sea currents, and wind direction. And all of this understanding depends on the Futuna language. Without it, the knowledge is lost. This knowledge is most certainly under threat today. And in multiple meetings that my team and I had with the people of Futuna Island, the topic of sailing and navigation came up frequently. And it turned out that many of the younger men under age 25 did not know or only partially knew the traditional wind compass, a cognitive device linguistically encoded that allows sailors to find their way home. I was able to record several sessions like this one, where the elder experts are teaching the wind compass system to the younger men of Futuna Island. Conceptually, the wind compass looks like this. It names 17 distinct wind directions in relation to named points of orientation on the island. If you master this system and you are out sailing, you can find your way home, even in darkness, fog, or rough seas, by identifying which wind is blowing at your back and pushing you towards your island. This system is surely one of the greatest intellectual and technological achievements of this small Polynesian people, and has ensured their survival on this remote island. But again, it depends entirely on the language. So we've been in Vanuatu, and then Siberia, and then Vanuatu again, all language hotspots. And our third language hotspot that I would like to visit today is in Oaxaca, Mexico, home to many dozens of languages. This past summer, I was able to travel to Oaxaca, Mexico with a group of undergraduate linguistics students and some faculty colleagues who are longtime experts in the region. Our goal was to apply the skills of field linguistics and environmental linguistics to learn about the Zapotec languages in collaboration with community members. This is part of our team shown in this photo. And the project was funded by our National Science Foundation. Among the remarkable people we met are the Chavez Santiago family, who are master textile artists. They not only weave beautiful rugs, but they also create all the basic ingredients themselves, using plants and insects to make the dyes, processing the wool, and incorporating traditional Zapotec design motifs that reflect nature. Their art and creativity, based on all natural materials, would not be possible without the knowledge that is passed along generationally through their Zapotec language. And they are contributing through their art to the revitalization of Zapotec. The daughter of this family, Janet Chavez Santiago, who's not shown here, is one of the primary authors of a Zapotec talking dictionary. In visiting the Zapotec-speaking pueblos, we met many individuals who are committed to saving their languages and the environmental knowledge that these contain. For example, in San Bartolome, Quialana, we met with Senor Renato Hernando and his mother, Maria Pilar Sanchez. In the course of interviewing them and recording some Zapotec words, Renato at one point asked me if I knew or wanted to know the names of birds in the Zapotec language. This question surprised me because Renato is blind. And even though he is blind, he identifies bird species according to the sounds they make, and he wanted to teach me the names of some birds in Zapotec. These words, along with many other nature-related words, are now included in the talking dictionary, which the community is creating with some assistance from our team. We also spent time with language expert and activist Moises Garcia Guzman, who led us through his garden and demonstrated many different domesticated plants and their nutritional and medicinal uses. Moises told us that he views the Zapotec Talking Dictionary as a way to pass on his language and to save it from being lost. So environmental linguistics, besides all of the attributes that I've talked about so far, it offers an opportunity to help decolonize the natural sciences, such as botany and zoology, because when linguists work in collaboration with botanists, for example, we can get beyond the false discovery paradigm by recognizing pre-existing indigenous knowledge. But environmental linguistics also offers an opportunity to decolonize linguistic science itself in three ways. The first way that this will help us decolonize linguistics is in our approach to knowledge. Environmental linguistics pays attention to the knowledge encoded in languages, not just the grammatical structures that encode that knowledge. In other words, we care about content as much as we care about form. Grammar and knowledge are intertwined and viewed as a holistic system. Knowledge is regarded as equally important to structure in the analysis. And this is an approach that is inspired by and consistent with how indigenous people view their own languages and knowledge systems. And I've heard this many times over, asserted to me in places all around the world in different ways. For example, in Australia, I met expert nature guide Neil Mackenzie. He is a member of the Rubibi, or Aboriginal people, who spoke a language called Yawuru, which is now nearly extinct. I accompanied and observed Neil as he demonstrated incredible survival skills in the Australian outback. Medicinal plant use, the ability to find water at any location, wayfinding skills, hunting and tracking techniques, predicting the weather, and many more traditional Yawuru cultural survival skills. Neil emphasized to us the importance of the landscape, saying that if I don't show you the land, you won't understand the language. It exists because of the land. It is in close harmony with it. Another way we can decolonize linguistics is to respect indigenous pedagogies and their strategies for language survival. How do small communities like the Rubibi people of Australia transmit their own languages effectively with limited use of writing or other technologies? And I know that later today, in this Berlin lecture series, you will be having an opportunity to hear from some indigenous language activists. So I would urge you to check out those lectures. When we visited the classroom of Doris Edgar, one of the last 3 fluent speakers of the Yawuru language in Australia, there was great pedagogical expertise on display. Doris devoted time every week to teach these enthusiastic elementary school children, some of whom had ties to the Aboriginal community, but some who did not. Doris uses a curriculum that was entirely based on talking about plants, animals, and nature. In fact, when we asked her about this, she said she did not see any point in teaching language that was separated from nature. This is an indigenous point of view that we should take seriously if we want to decolonize linguistics. A second way we can decolonize linguistics is in our approach to data and technology. Environmental linguistics does not view linguistic fieldwork as an exercise in data collection or data extraction. Instead, it recognizes the ownership of the language by the speech community and affirms their intellectual property rights, thus serving as a vehicle for the co-production and curation of knowledge. This means that when data is published or technologized, native speakers are not simply treated as consultants to be thanked in a footnote in a subordinate position to the linguist. Rather, they can be named as co-authors of the resulting work depending on their level of participation. Co-authorship is especially important for dictionaries. For example, in all of our talking dictionaries, such as the Futuna talking dictionary shown here, every single entry is credited individually to the person who recorded the word and who recorded their voice speaking that word. Everyone who contributed words is listed as a co-author. This can also be done with grammars, journal articles, annotated text collections, and the like. Our talking dictionary platform, which we launched in 2007 and recently in 2019, launched it as a free app, now has over 150 dictionaries, all from endangered and minority languages, and all collaboratively authored and owned by their respective communities. I would invite you to look at this app, download it for free, and think about creating your own talking dictionaries. So in closing, let me just recap through all these examples what I hope environmental linguistics can be. And although the label is new, this is not a new field of inquiry. Environmental linguistics has several aspirations. It explores environmental knowledge found at every structural level of language and in every speech genre. Secondly, it links language diversity and biodiversity and looks at the threats to both. It acknowledges that knowledge about the natural world is found primarily in indigenous languages, since indigenous people are the stewards and curators of most of the biodiversity on Earth. And these languages are the intellectual property of their speakers and communities. Outsiders and linguists do have a role to play. We can help to document and technologize with the consent of the community and on an equal footing with them. We can decolonize linguistics by taking seriously indigenous points of view, pedagogies, knowledge, and survival strategies. And we can collaborate with natural sciences like botany, zoology, as well as with indigenous science. In sum, we can use the tools of linguistics to help save the planet. And I'll just close by once again saying obrigado and thank you to everyone for watching this lecture. And Professor Chris Stenzel will now be hosting a Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harrison. That was a really interesting talk. We do have a few questions that have come in. So let me start off with the first question that came from Simone Gomez, who is at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. And what she wants to know is how you view the situation of endangered languages in our current context of the COVID crisis.
Thank you, Simona, for your work and your question. I'm fortunate that I haven't had direct experience of this. However, I have been keeping in touch with many of my colleagues who are members of small indigenous communities, and they are under very similar stresses that we are. And in the case of a small community, they are particularly vulnerable. In Vanuatu, for example, the government, knowing that they are vulnerable small island communities, took very early and decisive action, and they shut down the country entirely. And so everyone is under lockdown, and I've heard reports coming out of the Amazon or other places, out of India, for example, the Andaman Islands, reports by other linguists and anthropologists that the situation is quite dire for indigenous communities. Just as we know, in North America, poorer and more marginalized communities are disproportionately affected by this pandemic, and that also seems to be true worldwide. So I send my best wishes to those communities and look forward to meeting with them again when it's safe to do so.
Thank you. Another question comes to us from Eduardo Moll. No, that's pronouncing it the right way. He asks, would it be feasible to acknowledge a close relationship between ethnolinguistics and environmental linguistics? And how your thoughts on how that would relate to the Sapir hypothesis?
Thank you, Eduardo. Yes, as I said at the beginning of my talk, I don't think the field of environmental linguistics is entirely new. It is part of a great tradition that has been going on for a very long time. And I put into the foreground our indigenous colleagues first. So what they're doing is of greatest interest to me. But within anthropology and linguistics, there are also scholars. One of my mentors, Professor Harold Conklin, in the 1950s was using the tools of linguistics to explore environmental knowledge. And there's the great tradition of ethnolinguistics. There's also a tradition called eco-linguistics, which I am less familiar with, but in a couple of weeks, there will be a lecture in the Oberlin series on eco-linguistics. So I'm planning to listen to that lecture, and then maybe would have more to say about the comparisons or the connections. I think where environmental linguistics may be unique, or a little bit unique at least, a little bit innovative, is that we are specifically looking at the structure of environmental knowledge in languages. And that's actually a little bit narrower in scope, perhaps, than ethnolinguistics. So it's a subfield, certainly, but the focus is on environmental knowledge.
Thank you. The next question comes from Monica, and she would like to know if you could talk a little bit about some of the strategies that linguists can use to work on this kind of knowledge without being invasive, how to collect this data with in an efficient way, but without being invasive. And I just want to add in that Heitor has added to that strategies to work when you're working with populations that may have had little or no previous study and perhaps little or no previous contact. How to work on word classes and these kinds of lexical categories, that very specialized lexical categories.
Thank you, Monica. Yeah, this is a common situation because most of the world's languages have not yet been scientifically studied by linguists. And linguistics has, like anthropology, has some colonial baggage, which is why there's a need to decolonize. The strategy that I have taken with my nonprofit, the Living Tongues Institute, is to identify, recruit, train, mentor, and equip indigenous linguists in any community that we intend to work in. And that's a long-term commitment, but these indigenous linguists are passionate about their language. They are much better positioned to do a documentation or to write a dictionary. And they're absolutely devoted to the work. If we can find ways to support them, give them equipment, in some cases, a very small amount of funding, for example, for our colleagues in India, a small amount of funding can support them entirely and their family for a year to go trekking around to the villages, collecting words, which is something that I love doing too, but I don't have the time to go out doing it. So we're working on a mentoring and training model, I would say. And maybe the startup effort is greater than the linguist just going into a community and recording 500 words. But down the line, you'll get, I think, a better quality, more collaborative documentation. And the community should be reassured at every point that they own the data. They're in charge of the data. They have the say of where it's going to be shared. They get copies of it. So there are many interesting ethical issues, and I'm pleased to see that linguistics as a field is evolving to become more ethical in its relationships with indigenous communities, and I hope that continues. I don't have any comment or thoughts about uncontacted or less contacted communities because there's a whole set of other ethical problems, and I don't have that expertise. So I think other people would speak to that.
Thank you. The next question comes from Bruna Franchetto. She would like to know what kind of information or data are behind your definition of South America as an area with low-level linguistic threatening, as shown on your map.
Well, I'm delighted to hear from Bruna. We've known each other for many years and worked together in projects funded by the Volkswagen Stiftung. There have been a number of efforts to compile a worldwide index of language documentation. We're not quite there yet, but I think a lot of progress was made. There was an NSF-funded project a few years back. I think Lyle Campbell was one of the leaders in that program, where they attempted to simply inventory language documentation. And so it's a little difficult, but we can say that I've also asked many professional linguists the question, and I'll pose it to this audience. In your experience, what percentage of the world's languages are adequately scientifically documented? And in my experience in posing this question, linguists, professional linguists usually give me quite a low number, typically below 20%. And of course, we know that the threshold for adequate documentation is also changing. So perhaps 25 years ago, a dictionary and a grammar in print form would have been considered an adequate documentation. Maybe a dictionary, a grammar, and a text collection. Nowadays, documentation is not considered adequate unless there is also a digital corpus of audio and video recordings, as Bruna well knows because she's doing this kind of work. And so it's an interesting question. In our language hotspots model, we were combining three factors. So high diversity, high levels of diversity, high levels of endangerment, and relatively low levels of documentation. And it's that third parameter that is the most difficult to know. It's correct. Certainly there are well-documented languages in every language hotspot and in every country in the world, but there are also very poorly documented languages. The language that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, Raga, which is a language of Vanuatu, there have been hundreds of linguists working in Vanuatu for decades, centuries even. The early work dates back to the 19th century, but there are 113 languages in Vanuatu. And when I started looking into Raga, I found there was almost no documentation, even though it's one of the largest languages of Vanuatu with 10,000 speakers. And so sometimes you assume that something's been done, and then when you go and look at the documentation, it's relatively sparse. So it's part of a larger picture. I don't want to assign a ranking or a score to any country or region, but you can use the hotspots model, as we have, as a way to prioritize. If you want to look at an area of the world where the threat level is high and the diversity is high, but the documentation is medium or low, that's a way to help prioritize where should linguists go. Thank you again, Bruno.
Okay, thank you. Another question comes from Marcia Machado. She would like you to comment on whether or not communities have an idea of the importance of their environmental knowledge and of the research about their linguistic strategies of survival. What kind of feedback do they get from the research?
Thank you, Marcia. You know, in every community I've visited, expertise is valued and it is unevenly distributed. So it's very common to visit a community, and as soon as they find out that you're interested in plants, they will say, oh, you must go speak to this person, or too bad you didn't come 2 years ago. You could have talked to my uncle. He was the expert. Our knowledge is less than what he had. Or if you're interested in fish, anyone in the community. You know, we live, indigenous societies are, I would say, qualitatively different from us in their distribution of knowledge. Knowledge is less compartmentalized and more generalized. But they also recognize the role of experts and specialists. But you know, when I said that Anselon Saru can name 250 species of fish, he is by far not the only person on the island who could name 250 species of fish. And most people, I think, could easily name 100, even the people who don't fish ever. And so knowledge is, there are specialists and experts, and those can be identified. And then there's the phenomenon that knowledge is less compartmentalized and more evenly distributed. So for example, the people who know how to make medicines from plants also know where to find those plants and when to harvest them. And they know every single step in the production chain for those medicines. So it's more of a holistic knowledge. And yes, I believe communities attach incredible value, because how could they not? This is the knowledge that has ensured their survival. And they're also painfully aware that the knowledge is eroding. They're aware that when they send their children off island to attend the boarding school, those children come back home after a few years and they don't know about the plants or the fish. And I'm constantly hearing from elders in the community this lament that we're afraid we're losing this knowledge. And so that is one of the motivations when I present to them an open platform like the Talking Dictionary platform and say, you can co-author this knowledge and curate it and keep it as your own intellectual property. Would you be interested? I almost always have an affirmative response to that.
Thank you. Thank you. Monica sends another question. She would like to know about the influence of social media and sort of digital access on the languages being studied. She'd like to know if you think it plausible that a language will be able to be perpetuated, and endangered languages through access to study of that language, the information about that language is on digital social media kinds of platforms.
Absolutely. Social media is so powerful, and the savvy endangered language communities know that technology is not a threat to their languages, it is an opportunity. When I first started, and I'm not an expert on Mexico, but I've gone there several times and visited different communities. But when I first started going there, I heard people talking about activismo digital. And I said, what is that? I don't know that phrase. I mean, I can translate it in my head. It means digital activism. But at the time that I first heard that phrase in Mexico, I had never heard it in English and not in the United States. So it was an interesting concept coming out of the Mexican language activist community that digital activism was a special kind of linguistic and cultural activism. So these communities are putting forth strategies and philosophies for language revitalization that we should follow and pay attention to. It's not us bringing them a solution, it's them telling us, this is our agenda, this is what we want to do with our language. And oftentimes what they want to do with their language is to technologize it. I will use the Zapotec communities as an example. When we began building the Zapotec talking dictionaries, we had already built more than 100 talking dictionaries. And the Zapotec communities surprised us by saying, why can't we include tweets in the dictionary? And we said, well, no one has ever asked us to include tweets in the dictionary, but let's do it. So we redesigned our dictionary. The Zapotec are very big on Twitter, and they tweet back and forth in Zapotec. They might, for example, Moises Garcia Guzman might be out in his garden tending to his plants, and he might take a photograph of a plant and tweet it out along with the Zapotec name. This is a way of a form of pedagogy and knowledge preservation. And now we've configured our talking dictionary so that that tweet by Moises with a photograph of a plant and the Zapotec name can instantly be ingested into the talking dictionary. So it becomes part of the record. So really indigenous communities are leading the way. They're showing us new things because of the conditions they find themselves in and the pressures of globalization. They're finding new and creative things to do with technology that are very exciting.
Well, while we're on that topic, I'm going to just jump to a related question that comes to us from Lucieli Santos Pantoja, I think that's the pronounce it. She who asked, could you talk to us about the app? How long has it been built? And there's also a question about whether or not communities you work with are afraid of biropiracy and how you deal with that concern.
Thank you, Luciela. Yes, I built the first, I coined the term talking dictionary. Surprisingly, no one was using that term, but I coined that in 2005. And then I built the first talking dictionary. And it was a server hosted dictionary. And I realized that an app would be more appealing. So last year we launched an app which is free to anyone. Any community can download the app. If you just Google for talking dictionaries, you'll be taken to our site. You can download the app. And we conduct workshops all over the world too for people who want to do this, and remote workshops. You can download the app for free and you can begin creating your own talking dictionary. It's completely free. And what was the second part of the question?
Sorry. Yes, about if concerns about sort of spreading knowledge out on social media, and whether communities are afraid of biopiracy.
Biopiracy or bioprospecting, yes. Well, so I learned something from working with botanists and ethnobotanists. I work with Dr. Michael Bailiff from the New York Botanical Garden, and he has worked in many countries around the world and published many books on ethnobotanical knowledge. Now, this is the kind of knowledge that is vulnerable to bioprospecting, to pharmaceutical companies coming and taking some technique and patenting it and monetizing it without paying royalties to the community. So I was curious what his approach would be. When he goes into a community, he says to them, we are not interested in documenting or even asking for any secret or private or proprietary knowledge. We're only interested in documenting general knowledge that any adult person in the community would have access to. And so once you get past that and you explain that you're just looking at general knowledge, publicly known and available knowledge, then communities are quite eager to contribute their knowledge. Of course, there always remains areas of secret or proprietary knowledge that has to be accessed through initiation or other rituals, and so we don't document that. Now, if a community created its own talking dictionary platform, they could put it under password protection. It could be a closed resource that is only open to members of the community. And we have had a couple cases in the past where we created a talking dictionary that was private to the community for their own exclusive use. So that's another possibility. It's really up to the community to decide what do they want to share with outsiders and how do they want to share it. And they can exercise their ownership of the language in different ways. They could exercise their ownership by keeping it private or secret, but they can also exercise their ownership by sharing it and deciding when and with whom to share it. That's another way of showing ownership.
Thank you. Another question, shifting gears just a little bit, another question from Bruna Franchietto again. She would like to know if you could give some examples of strictly strictly grammatical phenomena, not in the lexical sphere, but a grammatical phenomenon that you would say are directly linked to knowledge of the environment.
Yes. Oh, thank you, Bruno. Great question. I really appreciate the opportunity. So as I thought about this, I began seeing environmental knowledge everywhere. So then I thought about, well, is it really at every level of language structure? So for example, can the phonetics of a language encode environmental knowledge? And I have several case studies which argue that it can, including my own work on Tuvan, where Tuvan has a system of sound mimesis where a speaker of Tuvan, and they're very, very attuned to the ambient sound environment. So you can do an ethnoacoustomology of Tuvan and investigate how they're attuned to the natural environment. And in the Tuvan language, using the phonetics and the phonology, they have the ability to make entirely new sound mimetic words that will be understood by another speaker of the language. So if you're a Tuvan speaker, you can hear a sound, you can make up a new sound mimetic word on the fly, and the person you're speaking to will understand whether you're talking about a high-pitched sound or a low-pitched sound, a friction sound or an impact sound. So they have an interesting system for creating new sound mimesis. At the level of syntax, you could question, but I like to think about morphosyntax. And so certainly at the level of morphology, there are numerous ways to encode environmental information. The Tofa, the reindeer herders that I worked with, have an olfactory suffix, which you can attach it to any word and it means smelling like that word. They also have a suffix that is part of their topographic directional system that only applies to rivers. It means that you are traveling along parallel to a river. And so prepositions aren't usually, or postpositions in this case, aren't usually a place where you would look for environmental knowledge. you would look at the lexicon first, but then you begin to see that it spills out of the lexicon and it spills over into the phonetics, the phonology, the morphosyntax, certainly metaphors, taxonomies, idioms in the language, and then of course all of the verbal arts, genres, riddles, storytelling. So yes, but I also share your skepticism that if you wanted to say, look purely at the level of the syntax of a language, it might be hard to show an example of environmental knowledge that's encoded purely in syntax and nowhere else. But that's kind of an artificial exercise in dissection too. So languages are holistic. And what you find with indigenous languages is that they are saturated with environmental knowledge. Even a simple task as just taking a good dictionary of an indigenous language and counting up the percentage of words that relate to the environment, it's much higher than you would find in a French or English dictionary. They're simply saturated with environmental knowledge. And so my assertion is that, my hypothesis, I guess, is that you can find this knowledge at all levels of linguistic structure, including morphosyntax and phonetics.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry for the long answer.
No problem. It's not an easy question. It wasn't an easy question. The next question, if you have time for a couple more, there are not too many left. This comes from Adriana Capuchinho. She would like to know have you or your research group worked in participant research in anthropological terms, strict terms, as Geertz proposed?
Well, we're certainly influenced by Geertz and by participatory anthropology, and one certainly tries to achieve the emic perspective. As an outsider, you cannot. And this is why I think any linguistics research team documenting a language is incomplete if it does not have on that team members and native speakers of the indigenous language who are going to be trained in linguistics or lexicography. So you always have an outside perspective. I've tried, I lived with the Tuvan nomads for a full year. I didn't speak English or even Russian when I was living with them. So I tried to immerse myself in the language. It's a transformative, wonderful experience, but there are limits to how many times or how long you can do that. So the solution is to have a team that is made up of members of the indigenous community who are native speakers of the language and committed to the survival and documentation of the language, along with outside experts, linguists, or anthropologists.
Thanks. I'm going through here. It looks like we're at the end of our questions, and
thank you.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate your bringing this talk to us. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to say that there is going to be a session with a sort of parallel theme on the 16th of June at 2 o'clock, moderated by Bruna Franchetto, that will have a group of researchers talking about sort of new directions in language documentation in Brazil. And so if people are interested, they're invited to that talk as well.